Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting for everyone to be admitted into the conference room. We are at 60 attendees and climbing. We're just waiting for everyone to be admitted into the conference room. Okay, I think everybody is here. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning on the launch of the SAPVIA jobs report. It's been a little while in the making, but it is finally here. So on behalf of SAPVIA and the CSIR, we welcome you to this. As you all know, as SAPVIA, we are very much promoting PV in South Africa. And as part of that mandate, also want to see job creation happen in our industry as much as that is possible across the sectors or at least the whole value chain. So it's great to actually be able to now put some numbers to those job creation metrics. So thank you for joining. The work was done by the CSIR, and we have both Ruan and Clinton from the CSIR here today who will walk us through this presentation. The actual report is only going to be available Friday. We've had some delays with the launch of that, but as of Friday, the formal report will be available to the public. But hopefully, yeah, you will all find what's presented today interesting and helpful. So again, thank you for joining. I must also say a big thank you to our sponsors. All of the sponsors' names will be read out shortly as we go through the report, but this work wouldn't have been possible without them. So we really, really are grateful to everyone who assisted with this report. So again, thanks for joining. Ruan, over to you.
All right, just to make sure, am I audible to everyone?
Yes, Ruan, we can hear you fine.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. I think formal introduction first. My name is Ruan Fourie. I'm an energy economist working for the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research in energy industry as the unit that I'm specifically working in. I'm also the secretary of the Council for the South African Association for Energy Economics. So I think today is really a landmark day. The work that has been done as part of our study here, I don't think it has been attempted before in the context, at least, of South Africa. We have, through the study, also taken an opportunity to look at how it has been done internationally. But I think it provides a platform for discussion and information that has been long overdue and waiting in the wings for many individuals. But before I drone on for too long, I'm just going to turn off my video for the sake of ensuring that the quality is good, because now everybody knows how I look and who I am. So I wanted to start off the presentation by first thanking also the sponsors. I think everyone that you see on this screen here has contributed financially to this objective. And I think it just shows the importance of the research community as well as industry in answering the jobs question for solar PV. There's real importance in answering that question and a real need for that for policy decision makers, for the industry themselves, and also for researchers to understand and get a grip of how many jobs are being created, have been created, and could be created by the industry as a whole. Just in terms of the agenda that we're looking at today, it's very structured, so I'll try to keep it as structured as possible. Please do bear with me. It's going to be a long presentation because the approach that has been taken has been a systemic one, a very, very detailed and systemic approach to try and obtain the necessary information that we need. So we'll start off with the introduction. I'll run through the project methodology according to the 4 phases that the project had. We'll go through the results of the scenario forecasting. We'll speak to how we looked at validating the study results, at least partially because of time. I couldn't include all of the validation that we have done. And then Clinton will take us through the key observations, outcomes, risks, opportunities, and also his take on where this work could lead. So let's get straight into it in terms of the introduction. I think everyone here is familiar with the solar PV market in South Africa, mainly split between utility and embedded markets. The embedded market spans residential, commercial, industrial applications. And then, of course, we know that utility is mostly large utility scale ground mounted projects that we found in the IPP space. This is the history that we have in South Africa. The objective of our study was to try and quantify the analysis and do a quantified analysis of the existing and future job creation potential and impacts of the solar PV value chain in South Africa. We did this by doing a comprehensive audit of the number of jobs that have been created in the sector, both for utility and embedded markets. We surveyed the data that was analyzed, and then we converted that data into usable metrics to forecast past and future job creation in the solar PV value chain. It's a nutshell, but let's move to the project methodology. As I've mentioned before, it was a very systematic approach that we took. We didn't want to jump straight into trying to find a solution. How we started off was to try and identify the preferred metric that we should report the information in. We conducted a detailed literature review of both local and international best practice of reporting real job numbers or actual job numbers, trying to find methodologies that had been employed overseas, and we identified various gaps and also what that exists both locally and internationally. In essence, what we then found the best practice would be is the full-time equivalent jobs per megawatt per annum. But each one of these phases, I'll go through some detail in the slides that follow. The contact list was then needed to be constructed and sorted. So because there's limited information available of exactly how many players and stakeholders are within the solar PV value chain, we needed to create our own company list. This was done through aggregating various sources that we could find from SAPVIA on our own side, using social media platforms, using interactions with specific industry stakeholders. Wherever we could find a viable company that has been listed that works in the solar PV value chain, we collected that, and we got close to 1,000 companies. I think the final number was 927. After we collected all of these companies, we had to sort them across a specified value chain. I'll go through this value chain, but you can imagine before we get there how we needed to sort it. After we had created the contact list, we sorted it. We needed to start with data collection. We constructed a survey. We distributed the survey after we created a platform for it via telephones, email. We tried every possible manner to collect as much of the information that we require for our analysis that we could. Once the data had been collected and aggregated, we then converted that to a jobs per megawatt figure for 2018 and 19, but I'll get to further detail on that. And lastly, we conducted analysis of 4 scenarios for the power sector, both utility and embedded scales, to try and see, firstly, how many jobs had been historically created based on the deployment of solar PV, and also look to the future and see how many could be created across different scenarios. That's in a nutshell. Now let's open the nutshell. Let's start with the phase 1, which was identifying the preferred metric. As I mentioned, we investigated international and local reports on jobs analysis and tried to find a specific metric that can be used. We saw that there are various gaps, even in the likes of international organizations like ARENA that has to aggregate a lot of information from different nations. But the gaps that we found was there's a lack of a standardized metric. I think everyone and many of the researchers on the call would know this. We found that there is difficulties in comparing job numbers of new renewable technologies with more fossil fuel-based technologies. And I think there are specific reasons for that. I think even in South Africa's case, Stats SA is still planning on how to specifically allocate where the renewable energy value chain should feature their job creation. Lastly, we found that there's difficulties in distinguishing between construction and O&M jobs in various of the sources. As I mentioned, there's a lot more to it and we won't be able to go through. I mean, it's a much longer report, but please do read the report when it comes out on I think either Friday or Monday. What we could find from the literature review is that what is most commonly used is a full-time equivalent job, not job years or anything like that, a full-time equivalent job per annum, to try and quantify in a year how many jobs have actually been created. Considering what we found in the literature review and considering the best practice that we also saw, we made the decision to use full-time equivalent jobs per megawatt per annum as the basis that we would use to estimate historical and future job creation as a result of solar PV deployment in South Africa. We'll go into how exactly this has occurred and happened in the results section, but let's continue with the methodology. As I mentioned at the start, we needed to construct that contact list because to get to the job intensity metric of jobs per megawatt per annum, we needed to identify the companies and contact them for the information that is required. To determine the present job intensity of the solar PV, we did that survey with all the companies to create the contact list, and then containing the local companies working in a portion of that solar PV value chain. Once we had collected as much of the information as we could find, or as much as the contact information we could find, as I mentioned, we got to close to 1,000 companies, but that was half the job. We needed to ensure that those companies are properly sorted across a specified value chain. And also in this first part of just constructing the contact list, we needed to make sure that they exist. So there was a lot of Google search, there was a lot of phone calls made just to make sure that the companies are in existence. Once we had collected them, we sorted them across this value chain. But again, with the inputs from SAPVIA, that was really good. We broke it down to a very granular level. We first separated it between IPP, services, manufacturing equipment providers, EPCs, and SSEG. But there were subcategories that add value for a solar project amongst each one of these larger PV value chain segments. So under IPPs, there were project companies, IPP companies, and developers. Services were legal, funding, logistics, consultancies, and then other. Manufacturing were inverters, panel, tracker, and then the balance of system. EPCs was utility and commercial industrial scale, and then SSEG was just residential scale systems or companies. We searched every company that we could find, contacted them if it was not clear where they belonged, and sorted them across this specified value chain, because you need to understand how many jobs are created for each one of the subcategories of the value chain as well. They add jobs for the same megawatt that's being deployed. So you need to consider all of them. We then calculated through the actual data, the job metrics, but I'll get to that in a minute as well, to get the job intensity metric for the utility and embedded markets. But how did we do that? So the survey that we constructed, it was firstly a much longer survey, but we realized that standardizing a survey across a value chain as broad as the solar PV one is sometimes difficult, because many companies, especially on the smaller scales, do not keep as detailed records as people are looking for. So we ended up shortening the questionnaire to something much more concise, which spoke to the number of permanent employees per annum, the number of contract employees per annum, installed capacity in megawatts per annum, the number of projects in a specified year, and the type of service or manufacturing that they are providing to the solar PV value chain. We collected this information for 2018 and 2019. The reason for that being is there were large gaps in the data in earlier years, most likely due to policy uncertainty from 2015 and onwards. So we wanted to get the most recent data in the first place, but also information that was mostly available across the entire value chain and specified. We needed really good information, and we needed concise information. So let's talk about the information themselves. The data collection process was at least 6 rounds of email and reminder emails, more than 800 plus phone calls to every contact that we had on the contact database. Through the help of SAPVIA, we developed an online platform to collect the information from responders that were then contacted through either email or phone calls. And once we had collected the information from them, we went through each and every data point that we had collected to ensure that the information actually made sense. Where there were discrepancies, we contacted those data points again to make sure that the information that they had shared was accurate and up to date. The table that you see below is a snapshot of what we found. So you'll see in the IPP value chain segment, we surveyed 116 companies, 15 responded, 13% response rate. Services is massive, 243 companies, 29 responded, 12%. Manufacturing, 91, 16, and 6, but manufacturers provided really good information. Probably from all of the categories surveyed, they had their fingers on the pulse of the exact numbers, I think probably the best. On the EPC for utility and CNI, 167 surveyed, 16 responded. On the SSEG, 319 companies surveyed, 31 responded. it's a large data set that was surveyed. I think the data points that were collected were of good quality because of the validation that was completed. And then when we had the information, we could use the information to calculate our job metrics for 2018 and 2019, at least, because this is the information that we got. Once we had 2018 and 19 job metrics for each part of the value chain and segments, we then consolidated them for a single metric between the two, or an average between the two, that could be utilized for the forecasting analysis that could be done. So what you see on the table below is the metrics that we found. You can see that services has a lot of permanent employment opportunities. IPPs very low, relatively speaking. Manufacturing are relatively good permanent employees, but again, there's that critical mass that is required of consistent deployment. EPC utility is interesting. A lot more contract work happening there because the individuals are compensating for uncertainty within the market. The same trend can be seen for EPC C&I, and SSEG dominates everything else. I think it's just the sheer case of how many individuals are within that market and how many people are employed to do smaller projects every year. So that was the metrics that were found. To put it in a more or in a nicer format, this is the difference that we found between the utility and the embedded markets. On the utility side, you see about 17 jobs being created for every megawatt deployed, while on the embedded side, 39 jobs, full-time equivalent jobs for annum is being created for every megawatt that's being deployed. So you can see that the embedded market is relatively outpacing the utility side. But there are various things that could be said in this. I think it shows the potential and the opportunity that exists in the embedded market, and also speaks to some of the aspects that Clinton will highlight later of ensuring that the embedded market is unlocked as far as possible. But the utility side is not gone. It plays an extremely important role for the grid as a whole, but that's a discussion for another day. Now that we had the metrics, we needed to ensure that we moved to phase 4, and we developed the scenarios that we want to forecast and look at historically and future job creation of the solar PV value chain. We did this in various manners. I think firstly, let me first mention there are 4 specific scenarios that had been put forward. The base case scenario you can actually see as the least or the worst case. I didn't want to call it the worst case scenario, but we wanted to have really the lowest it could possibly be as the first scenario. This is just based on, and the limitations were very much in what had been confirmed at the time of this, that the study had been completed for utility embedded scale. If we could find a reputable reference of megawatts that had been installed for utility and embedded scales, we included that. If there was not information, we didn't have information, so we didn't include it. So it was limiting in that way. And the base case scenario is a backward looking. So it's looking from 2011 to 2018, what had been created based on probably the lowest amounts of solar PV that could have been deployed. The IRP scenario is something I think many of the individuals on the call would be familiar with. It's a forecasted future view scenario that only looks at the IRP as we know it for 2019 and as it has been promulgated, so nothing strange there. The accelerated scenario, we relied on the systems team at the CSIR to do a detailed analysis of what the model could do if we unconstrain it. So they provided us with deployment figures for both utility and embedded scales for that. And we ran that scenario as well. It's also a forward-looking one. The last scenario is a high road scenario, and really the one I think is the most valuable in my opinion. It has probably, this is now again the best case that you could possibly have. We needed to find an innovative way of looking at how many embedded generation projects had actually been, or how many embedded generation megawatts had actually been deployed in South Africa. The SAPVIA team suggested that we use import data, and we did exactly that. We got historical import data from a source that we have called Quantec. We worked with that data to convert it to a megawatt figure across those years, and then we added the accelerated scenario, which is forward-looking. We had a full image of the amount of megawatts that had been deployed in South Africa, and also the base amount of megawatts that could be deployed into the future. So those are the 4 scenarios. I'm sure there might be questions later, but for the sake of time, I just wanted to touch briefly on how they were constructed. This is how they look for both utility and embedded scales. You can see the base case scenario is a very low estimation in many instances of how many megawatts had been deployed, especially on the utility and embedded sides. The IRP scenario is nothing different. The only addendum there is that the gap in generation capacity was split across 4 years between 2019 and 2023 on the embedded side. The accelerated scenario you can see is a bit more aggressive in the way it deploys in the short run at least. And then you see the base case scenario, which combines that import view that I mentioned previously, and then looks at the best possible scenario into the future. These are just the deployment figures that we found for utility and embedded scales. So now we get to the results. This is where things, I think, become very interesting, and I think probably why many of the individuals have joined today's discussion. So let me first start off with some general things that we found. Multiplying the installed annual capacities with that, the job metrics that have been calculated, and I showed previously from the survey data, it provides an estimation of the number of construction and O&M jobs created across the solar PV value chain. The one challenge that we found is that not all individuals within the solar PV value chain could state when their jobs were applicable during construction or O&M. The split was sometimes difficult, especially in the services side, where it sometimes overlaps. So instead of trying to add that level of complexity to the survey, we utilized the IGERA model that the CSIR has been using for many years to get a sense of the annual split between construction and O&M jobs, just for a single year. And per year, using the metric also that I mentioned previously, about 3% of the employment opportunities based on the IGERA model are found in O&M jobs. That sounds like a very small amount, but trust me, it grows exponentially as the years go on. So let's look at the results of the 4 scenarios that were looked at. So we start off with the base case scenario. And as what you find here, and you can see we also split them according to their value chain segments, but what you find here is that very small amounts of jobs, 41, 43 for 2011, 2012, and then you see the ramp up with the IPP program that started. So you see 2013 and 2014 massive years, and then you see a very significant drop between 2014 and 2015. And you can also spot, perhaps if I can show my mouse here, you can see that the main losers from 2014 to 2015 were the manufacturers and the EPC utility. And that's because there was a gap in procurement that delayed the process quite dramatically and caused about 70% of the critical mass that the sector was contributing towards job creation in the power sector in 1 year. 2016 it rebounded, and again, interesting here, you can see that while the utility scale did rebound, the bulk of where more of the installed capacity or jobs are coming from is in the EPC C&I, as those EPC stakeholders try to diversify and look for opportunities in the smaller scale embedded market. And then you see a sort of a leveling out in 2017 and 18. Remember, this is the worst case scenario based on very small amounts of information that could be verified. So it provides you with the worst case of the number of jobs that could be deployed. Let's look at the IRP scenario, one that we're all familiar with, using the same metrics and the same method of calculation. And this is what we found. You see that there's a bit more of a consistent growth from 2019 to 2021 as jobs sticks up. In 2022, which is in our case next year, you see a massive jump because the gap in procurement is seen to be filled by solar PV. And then it starts to taper off again to 2024. And the 2024, 26, and 27 are again gaps in procurement of solar PV. You can see the detrimental effect it has on the industry. Because there are these gaps in procurement, you lose the jobs that were created in construction. So from year on year, from 2020 to 2024, you see about a drop of 50%. Then the assumption is made that the industry can respond again the year after that, and again employ another 15,000 people to get back to 31,000, and then suddenly they lose half of that again. This is very detrimental to the long-term sustainability of the industry in my point of view, but we'll get to that again a little bit later. In terms of the accelerated scenario, you see a much smoother deployment here. And more importantly, you also see here the effect that O&M jobs have while consistent deployment is occurring. There's still a massive drop. 2022 is still seen as a year where this large amount of the deployment is required to meet the generation gap. But after that, you see consistent annual procurement of 500 megawatts, but you see a gradual increase. And that's because the O&M jobs have been created, but they will exist for the full lifetime of the plant. So you see a consistent growth. There's another graph that follows after the final scenario that sort of illustrates how construction jobs are very varying and variable in their nature, while O&M jobs continue to grow over the time frame. And I think is really it's a positive sign that there is such expectation of growth on O&M jobs, even at a rate of 3%. The final scenario, and this is the one I mentioned earlier with the import information and then the accelerated scenario combined, you can see again, there's a lot of jobs that are being created per annum. And you see that same trend of O&M jobs ticking up between 2023 to 2030. There's still some losses here and there as a result of large procurement in a single year and then massive drops in others. But this scenario, I think, is well represented of how many jobs have been created since 2012 that could also still be supported today because they are O&M jobs. And then you have an unconstrained viewpoint of how solar PV could be deployed into the future. In essence, you're looking at between 33,000 and 39,000 jobs being supported through construction and O&M jobs per annum between 2023 and 2030. I think it's a positive sign for the industry as a whole. These are the two graphs that I just wanted to illustrate the variability that we found between construction and O&M jobs. The first one is looking at the full-time equivalent jobs per scenario, and this is the construction side. So you can see, especially if you look at the IRP, those gaps in procurement show the job losses for that scenario in 2024, 26, and 27 as they drop off. At the same time, the other scenarios are a bit more consistent because they're based on the accelerated scenario. But again, what we see here is gap in procurement results in job losses due to job losses in construction phases of the solar PV value chain. The O&M jobs look much better, and this is what I wanted to touch on, just in terms of the opportunities that are being developed over time and why consistent procurement is required, not only for consistent job creation per annum, but the O&M jobs to grow over time. You want them to accumulate over time because they will be lasting the life of the plant. So you see that in each scenario, there's a gradual increase. As more deployment is occurring, those O&M jobs that just add on to one another. And the positive that we have here is when you reach year 25, and there hasn't been a massive breakthrough in supercapacitors or battery technology, or any other technology for that matter, you will be replacing the installed capacity again with new ones. So then there's again construction jobs being created and the O&M jobs being replaced. Those are in a very small nutshell, again, considering time, the results that we found for the analysis. But we didn't just want to publish this, we wanted to find whether they speak in some way, shape or form to what we had seen previously in other studies or in other methods of calculating job creation in South Africa for the solar PV value chain. The first port of call, as we know, is the IPP office. The only challenge we had is that the IPP office does not disaggregate the information to a technology-specific point of view. So we needed to look at whether there is a significant difference or an obvious disconnect between the job numbers that were reported in a specific year and what we were finding in the analysis. We chose 2016, 2017 from that report. The report from the IPP office had shown that 31,000 total job years had been created for South African citizens. We found with the analysis that we did that in 2017, based on the base case scenario, about 8,636 full-time equivalent jobs were created. So there's no major disconnect. It's not radically different. Obviously, it would be more useful to get a sense of how many jobs had specifically been attributed to solar PV. But the best we could do there was to state that it was not an obvious disconnect, but it was not enough. We wanted to also look at our theoretical models that we use, the IGERA model, to see if there is some massive difference. And these results were very positive to us. We utilized the same solar PV deployment figures as we did with the IRP 2019 scenario, and we ran it through the IGERA model. It provided us with a job number using IGERA of about 34,776 jobs in 2022. Compared to the methodology that we had developed, it compares to 38,758 jobs, direct and indirect. So it speaks well to one another from the theoretical framework that we utilized, as well as the methodology we utilized here that speaks to specific information. I'm going to pause here and I'm going to ask Clinton to run through the final 3 slides, which speaks to the key observations, outcomes, risks, opportunities, and then the final slide that Clinton would like to just state where this work will take us. There's a lot more that I think should and could be discussed from what I have shared so far. And I think the launch is the first step towards that. For me, the key aspects that I found from the study, it is extremely difficult to quantify this information. But apart from that, it is extremely important that we take this platform further. The methodology that we have developed here, the process that has been developed is now in place. And this could be updated on a biannual or every 3 years or 4 years or every year, depending on how you would want to do it, to make sure that the jobs that are being created are realistic and are tracked as they are being developed from the stakeholders themselves. I'm going to pause there. I'll hand over to Clinton. Thanks, Clinton. I'll hand over to you for the final couple of slides.
Super, thanks, and thank you, Ruan, and good morning, colleagues. Ruan, thanks for a really great overview, and certainly thanks to the SAPVIA team, the sponsors, and the broader industry for engaging on this really important topic. And of course, today we focused on the solar PV value chain and the analysis there and the opportunities and the really good, exciting news that the solar PV industry really has in terms of not only what jobs it's created already to date locally in South Africa, real jobs, meaningful jobs, but also the considerable opportunity to scale that up further across the various scenarios. So it's really good news. I don't think that we are particularly surprised at all by the results. As Ruan was showing, it really is validated and in alignment with other international practices. And I think within all of this is to start to have some kind of level of consistency in the dialogues that we have, and that across the various stakeholders locally and internationally, that we don't proverbially talk past each other. And when we talk about jobs or FTEs and job years, one has to be very, very careful and very deliberate in exactly what one is referring to. And especially when we are then engaging those that are responsible for driving policy and steering the industry, that we're not making commitments that we can't see through or follow through on, and that what it is that we're promising as an industry, not just in the PV industry, but energy broadly, is actually going to translate and be part of a just transition. So a really, really important topic. Ruan, thanks for the hard work with you and the team and the support of SAPVIA. It was a joint project between the CSIR and SAPVIA teams. If you could maybe then advance to the next slide in terms of some of the key outcomes. I mean, we're talking about a solar PV industry that is still relatively in its infancy, approximately the last 9 years in South Africa. And some really interesting observations coming out of this work. Some of which we intrinsically knew, but where the modeling and the outcomes have really solidified that and given us a fact and science base upon which to make these observations. One of the big benefits coming out of the study is that we now have what we've called a contact database, or a database of nearly 1,000 companies that are working in the PV space. And that in itself is a huge positive sign in terms of solar PV and job creation. I mean, to now have nearly 1,000 companies registered in that database, companies that are doing work locally directly in the solar PV value chain. So that is an asset for us then to maintain as a country going forward. Really interesting is starting to unpack and understand what we call the job intensity and how that varies between the small scale embedded market and the large scale utility market. We've always known that the embedded rooftop market will inherently create more jobs per megawatt installed. It is more labor intensive. The projects are much smaller. One doesn't really get the economy of scale with the utility scale, but it's a very important market. And really quantifying here in job terms, the extent to which the embedded market will have the opportunity to create more jobs than the utility scale market. Now, that isn't to mean that the one is more important than the other. They're both equally important, but it does show the opportunity that the small scale embedded market also presents in terms of job creation. What we've also seen, something that we've quantified in actual job numbers, is the impacts of the delay of procurement, specifically in the utility scale market. But one would also be able to infer and analyze that in terms of the embedded market through a lack of certainty in terms of the extent to which embedded or self-generation on scale has been supported. And it's very, very clear as to what then happened in terms of job losses, specifically in solar PV construction industry, when the various rounds of the REAP program did not proceed as planned. We can see from the results that presently that the O&M jobs in the solar PV industry are substantively smaller right now than the construction jobs. Most of the jobs at the moment are in construction, and that really does inherently make a lot of sense. The good news, though, is that as we continue to install solar PV at embedded and distributed and utility scale, so that cumulative installation base grows, and we will start to see significant amounts of jobs, permanent jobs, long-term jobs being created in the O&M space. And interesting to see that based on our analysis, potentially in the region of about 40,000 FTE jobs towards the end of this century, a very, very achievable number. In fact, probably very under-ambitious in terms of what could be possible. And of that, more than a quarter to a third, we expect to be in the O&M space. So we will see gradually over time a shift from solar PV construction jobs to solar PV O&M jobs, which will be great from a job security and long-term job outlook. Next slide, Ron. So in analyzing this in terms of what it means, we see that there's a lot of job opportunity that will also be linked to the extent to which we start to localize the value chain in the manufacturing of solar PV. So at the moment, understandably, most of the PV panels, for example, are imported. There is a certain level of local manufacturing, and a lot of the balance of plant is localized. But there are still fairly large tranches of the solar PV value chain, specifically around panels, where we're very dependent on imports, and for good reason. But as we proceed with the rollout of the integrated resource plan, as the industry starts to become confident that there will be year-on-year multi-gigawatt new build of new solar PV capacity, not just in terms of distributed embedded market, but very specifically large-scale deployment in the utility scale market, as per the RFP. So we'll see a lot more opportunity for increased local job content, increased local manufacturing, and then we'll start to see that job intensity values increase further, where we'll be able to create even more jobs per megawatt in the construction phase of these projects. We see a lot of opportunity in the SSEG market in terms of increased job creation. But of course, we need the enabling frameworks there, and the recent developments in terms of increasing the 1 megawatt licensing limit to, for example, 10 megawatts, and potentially, making it further easier for the development of embedded projects as a great step forward in that direction. And then to have that flexibility, in terms of PG project developers to be able to move between those markets and understand in any one point in time, there might be large-scale utility deployment. And then, if that changes or ramps up or down slightly in years, that by having a small-scale embedded market, that we'll be able to move resources and jobs between them, and be able to then sustain different periods of deployment in utility and embedded markets. Next slide, Ro. So really it's the last slide from my side, and it really is just looking ahead. As an industry and with SAPVIA, we have now created this contact database. Like I say, almost 1,000 companies now registered in that database. And it will be important going forward to maintain that, to start to create a data asset for the solar PV industry, with information being collected potentially on an annual basis, to be able to have a good understanding of what jobs are being created and where the industry is moving towards. So we really are suggesting that perhaps it's not annual, perhaps it's in 2 or 3 years' time, but to revisit this study, and then looking at the assumptions that were being made, and then looking at the latest data from the industry, actually testing and checking that, in fact, that jobs are being created at the scale and pace that was being envisaged. And through that process, seeing what is working, where are we creating new jobs, where are we localizing the value chain, and where then are the further opportunities to create more meaningful jobs as part of the economic development of this industry and a just energy transition. So a lot of opportunity, but a big word of thanks to everyone for their involvement, and especially to Ruan and the SAPVIA team. Thank you for the hard work here and for sharing these interesting results. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Clinton. Colleagues, the last slide is just an indication of how the cover pages for the 2 reports will look like, as will be published very, very soon. Please do read through them as well. I'm sure the discussion will continue over email and perhaps over Zoom or Teams or whatever the platform we use these days. I think for me, this study was extremely important for the industry. And I think the stakeholders themselves and the research community really needs to take hands. Clinton has mentioned the just energy transition, and it is something very close to my heart as well. The results and the opportunities that come from research that is done in this manner should really be capitalized upon quickly to unlock as much potential and benefit to the South African society as possible. I'm going to pause there because that is the end of my presentation. And I see there's quite a few comments, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can just view everything. And then I'll hand over to Maloba to facilitate the discussion further. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Maloba.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruan. Really appreciate it. I think just to start this Q&A session with a couple of thanks. I think it's important to thank the sponsors again. It's really important that, as SAPVIA, we are able to rally up the industry to be able to do this kind of very, very important work. And without the sponsors that have come on board for this, we really wouldn't have been able to do it, not just financially, but also from a technical perspective, inputting into the work that we see today. So thank you once again to all the sponsors. And a huge thanks to the CSIR team as well. We have had lots of virtual meetings, all of us wishing it was in person over brides and some drinks. But, just thank you for all the work and the patience and the iterative process that you've allowed us to come through to produce this work. And then lastly, thank you again to all the industry members, those 1,000+ companies that received the email and those of them that came back. I think an important point to be made there, just to take this opportunity, is that we absolutely need that data. I think a lot of companies get requests for many different reasons, official, research, and otherwise, for data and for information. It's really important to iterate that without this data, it becomes that much more difficult to make the case. So we really appreciate those companies that responded to the call and provided the data that has given us this work today. A few comments before we jump straight into the Q&As, and thank you for all the participants asking the questions. Apologies for the technical difficulty with allowing everyone to see all the questions posed, but we should be able to get through all of them. So I think at a high level, the data done gives the jobs created by the solar PV sector, gives an estimate of those jobs. And it's important to think of those jobs in a broader context. probably as important as thinking of them in their quantitative nature, right? So there are those jobs, but also it's in the context of all jobs that are being created in the sector. But it also begins to demonstrate the job security that rolling out solar PV generation capacity provides, so there are the jobs that the sector creates in its own, and then there's jobs that are maintained when all private off-takers are able to continue doing their business. And this is part of the longer term message that we want to be able to put out into the market and to the powers that be. And those last graphs that Ruan has so eloquently demonstrated really give us an ability to see the direct impact of policy implementation or not. So he mentioned several times gaps in procurement, and there's some questions around that we will address. But we now are able to see, and in a very real way, in terms of job opportunities created, what happens when we roll out policy and what happens when we don't. What happens when we adjust the levers of policy implementation. So it's such an important tool for us to have, because when we go to the table again and we look towards the next 10 years, there's empirical data with which we can say, let's roll out 1,000 megawatts every single year because this and this and this is possible in terms of job creation. And of course, that's just one aspect of the benefits that we see from the solar PV sectors. And the last comment from my side is, these jobs are contributive, and what I mean by that is they are just the jobs created by the solar PV sector. There's a wider value chain that the sector in itself supports and is supported by, and so there's multiple factors that we might not have presented here but are real and tangible, and this is part of the renewable energy sector as a whole's contribution, which should be seen as part of a wider economy contribution to the unemployment crisis in South Africa. So we take these jobs in that context, and we look at these numbers in the context of everything else that needs to be done. So with those few statements made, let me jump to the Q&A questions that have been posed. There have been multiple that are repeats of each other, so hopefully we don't miss out on any unique questions here. I'm sure people will put their messages in the chat, but please do ask them in the Q&A session. So the first question, just to pose it to the CSIR team, is the difference in definition between project company and an IPP company. Maybe do you want to just answer that live, Ron?
Sure, I think that would be best. I was typing, but it'll take much longer to type than to say. So there were 3 sub-value chain segments in the IPP value chain segment that was considered. The developer is, I think, the simplest one. You have companies that develop the concept and sell that to IPP company, which would then take that company and do the next step to further develop it and then get it to the point of where it can be constructed. Normally at that point, or in some cases in that point, it can be then shared with a project company that would manage and oversee the construction of that specific facility. So there are 3 very, very different segments within that value chain, larger segment. It's very confusing, I know, but that was the distinguishing factor. I'm sure there might be some further clarity coming to that question as well, but I hope that provides some clarity at this stage.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ron. The next question, and I think it then is resonated through multiple questions, is whether the jobs being shown, let me read the question first. It says, are the jobs shown in the graphs new jobs per annum or just industry employment level per annum? And then the subsequent questions in a similar way are these new jobs per annum or total accumulated jobs? So if we can differentiate between those numbers on an annual basis and what they actually mean versus the accumulation of those job opportunities.
All right, so the way that you interpret the graphs that will be in the report and in the presentation to be shared is this is the contribution per annum of the solar PV industry to power sector job creation. Now, within that contribution per annum, there is a component of new jobs being created to new deployments in that year. So if there is a 500 or a 600 megawatt deployment happening in a specific year, whether that be a utility or embedded scales, that creates an amount of construction and O&M jobs in that year. The construction jobs will last for that single year. The O&M jobs will last for the life of the plant. So that's why you see on the O&M side and in the total graphs, you see this accumulation of jobs over time because the O&M jobs are gone. Where the challenge comes in is that the construction jobs end. That's the assumption that is made in the methodology. So if there is a gap in procurement for the next year, the construction jobs are lost. So that's the real challenge. So the viewpoint is you look at the contribution that the solar PV is making to an annual job creation in the power sector, but split between those. If more and more jobs are created through that consistent procurement, more and more jobs will be created per annum. I hope that is clear enough. I know it's a concept that is completely new, so it will be a bit strange.
Thanks for that, Rowan. I think without confusing it any further, it's worth just considering, and it's maybe a conversation for industry to have. It's worth considering that if you are say an EPC, you may keep some of the people that are involved in construction, and some may be temporary site-specific labor. So there is that nuance that the graphs don't necessarily demonstrate, but it is something to consider and to think about in terms of what those job numbers mean. Another question here is, where is it? I feel like it is now disappearing. Yes, whether the model has factored in the potential impact of the hydrogen economy and the jobs that will be created by the increase in renewable energy deployment. I think that'll be a simple one to answer, Ron.
Yeah, so we didn't specifically indicate any further opportunities above and beyond the scenarios that were developed. So if there is an expectation that more solar PV will be required to unlock opportunities within the hydrogen economy, the same methodology could be employed to determine how many further jobs would be created to support that from a solar PV perspective. But the analysis focuses purely on the amount of solar PV that has been installed and could be installed across the scenarios developed. It doesn't necessarily consider where those solar PV deployments will be utilized, especially on the C&I market. If it's utilized for a hydrogen economy opportunity, it can be, but we took a power sector view on the entire breakdown.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ron. I think there's a question I was looking for that has been answered here, but I'll read it and answer it and read the response from Clinton to all participants. It says, what is the ratio of long-term jobs versus jobs created during construction? And again, it's along the same theme that we've been seeing. And I think it's really an important consideration in terms of the longevity of these jobs. And the response there is that at the project level, operations, O&M in a year, this is a few percentage of the total jobs that we would have seen in the construction year. But as Ruan has said in the presentation, that the O&M jobs are cumulative as plants are constructed and are operated. So they grow over time. And so by 2030, we're expected to be around 25 to 35% of the total jobs at that time coming from the solar PV industry. So we can see that growth. And I think that is, while the instantaneous annual job opportunities are important, what is more important from the sustainability perspective are those O&M jobs, and the continued rollout of generation capacity means that we can see year on year more plants coming online into operation, where we see more permanent, higher quality jobs, if we can call it that, coming on and increasing the ratio of actual jobs being maintained by the sector over time. So that's a really interesting illustration. Right, let me jump to the next question. I think a lot of them were around annual jobs, etc. So a question here is around if we can, what is the level of granularity which our research has developed between looking at skills, racial profile, age, category, contract versus long-term, and remuneration at various levels of this granularity. Do you maybe want to speak to that quickly, Ron?
Sure. So the challenge is that getting the responses, and I'm sure it was indicated in terms of the responses to the surveys and the amount of effort it took to get those responses captured, is significant. And in many cases, the companies themselves are not, they're not researchers like myself and Clinton, so perhaps they do not have time to spend a lot of time answering the questionnaire. The original questionnaire had a lot more detail to it to try and unlock that, but companies either did not have that information on hand to respond quickly and readily to the information, which much of this pertains to. I would say, as mentioned in the questionnaire that was done, we did not go above and beyond in terms of skills, racial profile, age. The category is captured. The remuneration is not captured. The contract versus long-term is captured. So some of them have been captured, others have not. But it is a case of what the specific company has on hand and readily available to share without bothering them too much for the information themselves. I hope that is out. But for me, it is extremely important in further iterations. And with the awareness, I think that the results in this launch is bringing, when we run this scenario again and this methodology again, this could easily be unlocked with the platform that has been built.
Right, thanks, Ron. There's a question here about which of the two sectors, your embedded generation versus utility scale, creates more jobs. I'm just noting that question has been asked, and I think Clinton did actually indicate in his section around, the difference between the two and the jobs coming out of that. So let me jump to a slightly different question that's been asked here by Manfred, which says, based on the job forecast shared today, is training and skills development able to cope with this growth? And this is it has been suggested this would be a useful aspect for us to consider. So I'm going to ask that Ruan, you do speak to that, and then if Niveshan can also maybe come in terms of the PV green card work that we're doing.
So from my point of view, it's a very good question, Manfred, and thank you for it. In terms of the training and skills development that is required, I think the training and skills that is being developed by SAPVIA and on platforms that Niveshan will speak to, I'm sure, around the PV green card is critically important, but we do have that in place. What we have seen is that the industry can very quickly respond to sudden changes and shocks in the demand for solar PV in South Africa. So I'm not too concerned that it won't be able to compensate for the demand that has been illustrated in the scenarios here. It's just a case of having the certainty. That is, for me, the more important thing, because especially on the manufacturing value chain segment, the manufacturers require certainty for a long period of time, for a long period of demand for modules to have large amounts of investment secured. If a manufacturer can turn around and say, it's easy to put it up, but to make the losses, if there is uncertainty or if there's a lack of demand for whatever reason it might be, is sometimes detrimental to that growth. So I personally feel, at least in terms of the IRP, definitely, in terms of the high road scenario, which was the final scenario, with a little bit of effort easily, I think so. But Niveshan, I'm sure you'll also unpack a bit more.
Thanks, Ruan. Thanks, Maloba. Yeah, so when we talk skills development, there's various levels of skills development, right? So when you look at scarce skills, for example, scarce skills in solar PV is now currently being identified. And we are working with the SETAs and Department of Higher Education and universities to identify the scarce skills, and not only identify them, but figure out what is the plan to mitigate that missed opportunity in the South African market for scarce skills to be built and rolled out across solar PV. And these skills are particularly in the manufacturing sector and the engineering sector for the development and construction of solar PV components and solar PV projects. When you come to formal education, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done across the formal education sector through universities and TVET colleges in rolling out solar PV skills. So as the association I think about 4 years ago, we've developed a solar PV technician qualification that is registered with SAPVIA, that is registered with QCTO, but still hasn't been rolled out 4 years later. And this sits squarely within the CETA's mandate and within Department of Higher Education's mandate to actually use that curriculum and roll it out across universities and TVETs. So there are still hiccups or challenges around rolling out those skills, but there are a number of informal training opportunities or training programs that are being run to fill the skills gap in the meanwhile, PV Green Card being one of them, right? So foundation of PV Green Card is skills, but this speaks to small scale embedded generation only. So projects under 1 megawatt usually, and grid-tied projects, solar PV projects behind the meter. So we look at skilling that market segment because there's lots of gaps. There's not too much room for engineering budgets to cover the quality and the controls that are required for these projects. So we focused a lot of that. I can tell you year on year, the PV Green Card is looking at between 500 and 700 people that are being trained through this program.
Brilliant. Thanks. Thank you so much, Nivesh and Ron. Colleagues, I'm going to take one more question here in the Q&A panel, and I believe we'll have covered, say, 80% of the questions, and then I see my colleagues are furiously typing to answer the rest of them. So please do accept those answers as well. And I think this is a very, very important question. So I'm going to pose it, and then I'm going to have you, Rowan, provide your response to it. And then I'd also just like to close with a bit of a response to it as well. And the question, it says, how do the PV jobs projected in the study compare to the projected job losses arising from the implementation of the just energy transition as the coal-fired power stations are decommissioned/repurposed?
Sorry, just say that again. You were breaking up on my side, Maloba. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. It says, how do the jobs projected in the study compare to the projected job losses arising from the implementation of the just energy transition as coal-fired power stations are decommissioned or repurposed? I see Clinton is answering that, but I think we can also give a live response in case not everyone sees it.
So with the work that we have done in the just energy transition so far, we have got a sense of the amount of job losses that will be incurred over the next 10 years due to coal value chain decommissioning. It equates to over 40,000 jobs that will be lost, right? So it's speaking well in terms of the amount of job creation that is added per annum as based in this study. But the consideration here is that you need to consider where all of these solar PV jobs will be located. If you try to fit in all 38,000 jobs in 2029 into the Nkangala district municipality, I'm sure Nkangala would be quite happy, but it needs to be still a cost optimal decision based on the least cost optimization model. But in essence, I think from a personal point of view, while there is a contribution to be made by the solar PV industry towards a just transition, in that sense of coal value chain decommissioning and job losses, the solution needs to be broader than that. Solar PV must play a pivotal role in a broader solution of multi-sectors and multi-sector investment to really solve that job losses question. Otherwise, you're just exchanging one overdependent economy for another, to put it in that way.
Okay. Brilliant. Thanks, Ron. Thanks for that answer. And I'd like to respond to that with a suggestion. And the suggestion is possibly to reframe that question to say, what opportunities become available as we implement the just energy transition? Because what that reframing suggests or assumes is that there will be commensurate opportunities created in not just the deployment of solar PV, but the deployment of other renewable energy technologies, the deployment of other energy technologies like green hydrogen, the minerals energy nexus that we can realize with battery energy storage and mineral resources in South Africa, and the reskilling and multiple other activities that actually need to happen in order for the just transition to be realized. So it's important to frame it that way, not because we're saying there won't be job losses, but to rather look at where are the other opportunities coming in and where does the economy as a whole, because the just transition isn't just specifically an energy one. It's about how we redesign the economy to be more inclusive and more sustainable. And so where do opportunities arise in that entire rethinking of our next economy for job opportunities to come through? So I think a lot of the questions have actually been answered in the texts here. And if there's any others, we will catch them and we'll answer them in our closing remarks. But I'd like to leave those closing remarks to the chairperson of our chairperson of our industry association. So Vido, if you would please come up to provide your closing remarks, and we will just alert you if there's any other pressing questions that do come up.
Thank you, Maloba. Thank you, Ruan and Clinton, for this presentation and those job numbers presented. It was very long in the making, we all know that, but now we have got, I think, a very powerful tool that can show us where we could go. And I think the most important thing is that we shouldn't leave things at the IRP 2019. We all these days know that the energy gap that we currently have is much greater as the 2,000 megawatts. It is much greater in terms of, if one looks at the EAF from Eskom, what is needed to be done in the next years. We haven't looked into the green hydrogen topic, where there is more jobs that can be created. And remember also that in the IRP, there's only 500 megawatts in the embedded space. So that number should and will in the next years be increased quite dramatically, especially for private offtake. And there is a huge opportunity for the sector to really take over and take on a lot of jobs opportunities for South Africa. I believe that we will see in the next years to come huge opportunities in the sector, and that definitely the topic of skills has been mentioned here, has to be taken very seriously, that we really put all our efforts in to bring people across to these new technologies and to have a home and a job going forward. But also there's a huge opportunity for the young South Africans joining this new vibe, this new fantastic kind of industry. And I think that is also a call here, that we need to focus on young South Africans to find a home in renewables and join the solar PV industry. I think just in summing up, we've got a very good tool. We can now show some numbers, and I think this is the first tool, and we can further develop this with new numbers that we should go and consider going forward in the next year, that this tool and these job reports come out on a yearly basis, where we basically can see how we develop it and what further opportunities are there. So from my side, I'm very thankful to the sponsors, and want to mention also everyone there that really saw or came to the call from Simon Hall, who ran out and got the sponsors on board to fund this kind of study. I think that was quite an interesting time, where everybody saw the opportunity, said, yes, we're in, we're going to help. And I hope that for next studies we're going to do, we're going to get similar kind of support. So thanks again to those sponsors that helped to get this report done. That's it all from my side. I don't know if there's more questions that want to be asked, answered, but I think we have done a great presentation here, and I'm looking for the report itself on Friday or Monday, depends when it comes out.
Yeah, I think there's no more questions, Vido, so we can definitely close the session. Yeah.
Okay, then thank you, everybody. And by the way, next time we call for data, please participate. We really would like you all to participate. At least now we had about, I think, 95 participants here on this call, on this presentation. Please, when we put out a call for data, help us to get this, because that was one of the most difficult parts in this jobs report, to get the data and to interview people that can give us accurate data from different service providers in the industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.